We need more troublemakers. The world needs more troublemakers, and the church certainly needs more troublemakers. I don't know about you, but how many of you recall when you were younger and you were either in elementary school or high school or secondary school, as some of us call it, and your parents warned you, stay away from, don't go close to Randy. She's bad news. They are troublemakers. And then, to really layer the guilt on, we are told, remember, you're known by your company. Some of us kept our distance. Some of us looked longingly and were a little closer. And some of us just ignored the advice that was given to us and became troublemakers. Such was seen as always bad. Today, however, we know that there are good troublemakers and bad troublemakers. As we look around our world, we don't have to look far to identify the not-so-good troublemakers. Today, however, we focus on the positive. We begin with the premise that there have always been troublemakers. And from a church point of view, I want to highlight two figures. We think of 16th century German Roman Catholic monk and theologian Martin Luther, who played a leading role in propelling the Protestant Reformation as he nailed his 95 Theses to the church door. And we continue on to Martin Luther King Jr., the American Baptist and social rights activist in the mid-20th century who stood for equality and basic human rights for African Americans, all of the economically disadvantaged, and all who were treated unjustly. These saints from the initial stages of their protests were considered serious troublemakers. Martin Luther challenged the church, the Roman Catholic Church in Germany. Martin Luther King challenged the church across North America, the governments of the day, and society in general. They and women who stirred up trouble during their day did so because they would not and could not accept the status quo. They had a vision to perceive how things should be and could be. And in several cases, they risked everything they had to work, speak out, and promote desired change. And that, for some of us, is difficult. That word, change. Change, as is said, may be the only constant, but for some, it's terrifying because people prefer the perceived safety of that which is predictable and familiar. Our world has many troublemakers out there doing the best that they can in raising awareness, speaking up, speaking out, agitating, and hoping that more people will walk with them. Or for those who have died, people will follow through on their vision. I encourage you to pause a moment and think of someone you consider a troublemaker for the good. I think of the women in the famous 5 case, ensuring that women voted and were able to get into the Senate. I think of Mother Teresa. I think of people like Naomi Klein. I think of Jane Jacobs. I think of David Suzuki. I think of the late South African President Nelson Mandela and the late little man with a huge spiritual stature, Bishop Desmond Tutu. Both giants in the fight against apartheid. Different people, different approaches, but for the same desired goal. We look at well-known young troublemakers like climate activist Swedish Greta Thunberg, who sparked the ire of a recent past US president as she challenged world leaders about climate change. We know of Pakistani Malala Malik, the youngest person to receive the Nobel laureate, and her fight for education for females. They are not alone as activists. They are not alone as having gone to the United Nations to speak to them. We think of Chotiksens Martinez, an indigenous environmental activist who fights against fossil fuel and how it connects to global injustice and inequality. We think of Nambi Morris, a young Ugandan climate activist who constantly has his protest placards stolen from him, and last year was physically assaulted, and government confiscated his phone. We think of Ella and Amy Mink, two British young girls, ages 10 and 12, who started the protest against plastic pollution and launched the nonprofit Kids Against Plastic. There are so many other climate change makers around the world who need our support. Governments hear them, but in many ways they either hinder their progress or simply ignore them. Positive changes occur when there are positive and progressive troublemakers. And what about social concerns? The environment and how people live and are connected are all part of our socio-economic framework. The church, and for some of us, has played a major role in advocating. And for others, the church has not played an advocational role at all. So, unlike the US, where there are long-established black churches, Canada's church foundation is not so distinct. Yes, we've had several African Methodist Episcopal churches across Canada, but they've dwindled, as the remains of the one down on Lakeshore confirms. Some of you have already heard me tell the story of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, who were dragged from the altar of a Methodist Episcopal church in Philadelphia because they were seen as praying too long. Those two men decided to speak truth to power in the 1780s. Allen founded the AME Church. This church, we recognize, is very unique from all other Christian churches in that it was the first in the Western world that was birthed because of sociological and theological beliefs and differences. It simply rejected the negative theological interpretations which rendered persons of African descent second-class citizens. Richard Allen started the AME Church. Jones, however, went on to the Episcopal as an Anglican church and eventually became its first black bishop. Troublemakers for the cause of Christianity. They didn't give up. As there was a powerful black religious tradition steeped in social justice in the US, Reverend King was able to initially mobilize that group and then others. Here, the small numbers of black churches are not so active. So individuals and other groups stepped up to the plate. I'd like to introduce you to two groups. If some of you have ever traveled in earlier years across Canada by train, you may recall the sleeping car porters. All of them black, smiling, and hardworking, way beyond what they were paid. In fact, if they didn't receive tips, they would not have been able to live. Left families for weeks and weeks on time. It was in the 1950s that this group met with the government, who was still firm in its resolve in keeping Canada as white European as possible. These porters went to Ottawa and met with the government. Their struggle was met with indifference, but they kept persevering. And they not only became the first black union in Canada, but their request ushered in immigration reforms that prompted the government to be more accepting of all non-white peoples. This Canadian mosaic that we speak about today and are so proud of was spearheaded by this group. The struggle for marginalized and racialized people has never been easy. And unfortunately, sometimes the church that we hope would take the lead doesn't take the lead. Individuals had to address matters because they needed for change to occur. On the scene in Toronto came a mechanic and an activist, Dudley Laws, in the 70s and the 80s. He spoke about how the blacks were unfairly treated by the police, and there was indiscriminate shooting. We'd like to think some things have changed. But, as we say, the more things change, sometimes they remain the same. Dudley Laws was a thorn in the sides of the police and politicians. Marches were held, rallying cries of no justice, no peace. Laws was hated by so many. He became the founder of the Black Action Defense League, a group which some 50 years later was the forerunner of what we now know as Black Lives Matter. Laws persevered and led to the police reform and the creation of Ontario's Special Investigations Unit, an independent agency that probes incidents between civilians and the police. Now, there are many others outside of racism. Time would not allow the discussion for troublemakers for the LGBTQ2, women's rights, poverty, homelessness, food insecurity, and other disadvantaged groups who stood in firm convictions for justice. We are here. Where has the church been? Today, we declare here in Incarnation that we are troublemakers. Our New Testament text tells of Jesus thousands of years ago, who was nothing less than a troublemaker to the religious and the political leaders of his time. He shook up the established religious and political systems of the day, and this leads us to our text. You see, Jesus was woke, a term that you may have heard of that you probably don't even understand. This American slang term was taken on powerful meaning as of late. Woke, of course, is the past tense of awake, but it means simply being aware of and actively attentive to important facts, especially issues of racial and social justice. We are encouraged as Christians, as people of faith, to have a moral obligation to stay woke, to take a stand, be active, challenge injustices. Now back to Jesus. There is little doubt that during his 3 years of ministry, Jesus spoke his truth. Or as some may say today, he spoke truth to power. How ironic I find this, because it was an Indigenous female MP and our past federal Attorney General who really enlivened that phrase, speaking truth to power. We've heard it. It means supporting what is right and fair. It means that we're confronting authority, calling out injustices, and not only asking for, as has been done in the past, but demanding change. There's that word again. Change makes some people really uncomfortable. Jesus spoke his truth when he relayed the Beatitudes to the crowds, and he rephrased scriptures. The peacemakers are the children of God. The meek will inherit the earth. If you are persecuted, the kingdom is yours. He taught people that the dominion of God was already within them and told them that they were the salt of the earth. He advised us, don't get angry, turn the other cheek. Such revolutionary concepts. Jesus spoke truth to power when he relayed parables, which confused and consoled. He was a troublemaker when he confronted the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and other religious leaders. In today's vernacular, I can almost hear Jesus say to them, for goodness sake, get a grip. Your inflexible adherence to doctrine and dogma mean nothing to most people today. It's not helping them. It's turning them off. It's hindering them. On this Palm Sunday, we recall Jesus again, continuing to be a troublemaker. We think back in time, it is Jewish Passover, a volatile and political time for the Roman oppressors and the Jews. The time was meant to invoke and recall the divine act of liberation from another oppressor. Passover for the Jews was a culmination of the departure from Egypt out into the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and suddenly home to Canaan. There were political and revolutionary elements that ran through the celebration. People were hyped, as we do when we all get together in groups. Thousands were crammed into the city. The Roman army was on high alert and prepared to crush anything they suspected as suspicious. In comes Jesus, riding on a donkey, surrounded by shouting, cheering, waving, singing crowds in Jerusalem. He's on a donkey. He placed himself in a dangerous situation. This was a messianic show of intentional political intrigue. Make no mistake, Jesus knew what he was doing. The scene reeked of royal pretension. The crowds even called him king. When the fearful Pharisees warned him, he shrugged off and pronounced, "If these were silent, the stones would shout out." At some stage, another procession entered Jerusalem. The Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, rode in from the West Gate with a massive display of military pageantry. The possibility of conflict was real and could be felt in the dusty air of Jerusalem. But nothing happened, at least not then. Unlike the disciples of that day, we know where this story continues for the troublemaker, but also the hope that comes with the next steps. Today we find grace in the wilderness of our doubt, our despair, our discouragement. When we rise up and declare that enough is enough, I want to make a difference. That's what Jesus certainly did. We know that we are addressing issues of societal concern in our diocese, and certainly here at Incarnation, in our Echo Justice team, in our Amnesty affiliation, our signing of petitions, our community partners. But we need more troublemakers to join. We need more troublemakers to take on great causes. We have lots to do. And as was saying earlier, we need to stand. Stand for the things that we know are right. Scripture always leaves us with much to consider. Two questions come to mind. Where do I see injustice? What can I do to correct it? And then I deferred to renowned actor Denzel Washington, who challenged us with two more questions. It's all about who you have lifted up, or who have you made better? May God help us to be the troublemaking change agents we are as the Church of Jesus Christ. Amen.